Welcome back to this week's discussion of ancient Egypt. Please note that this lecture is divided into two parts, that I've also posted on D2L the slides only because many students like to download those slides as a PDF file for ready reference for studying for exams. Some students even print out all the lectures, which is fine, but I think it would be use a tremendous amount of ink and paper, but some students do that. Okay, we're going to start here looking very briefly at the map we saw of the Middle East, which we saw at the end of our discussion of Mesopotamia and prehistory. Now we're moving into, quote, history, because we have a written record which greatly helps historians study the culture, society, and other historical developments of civilizations. You'll recall our last class, we ended with the Sumerians using the first recorded writing in this area of the world. And so now we're moving down to Egypt, which you can see in this very general map is characterized by having desert all around it, the Nile River, which flows from Central Africa, the rainforest, and it flows north to the Mediterranean Ocean. And we'll talk a lot about that in a few minutes. You may have heard about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Don't worry, I won't ask you to list all 7. But what's important for us now is 2 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The first 2 on this list are in Egypt. The Great Pyramid of Giza, that's the only one of the 7 wonders that's still remaining. And there is also the Lighthouse of Alexandria in northern Egypt on the Mediterranean Sea. That is no longer standing. And in recent years, archaeologists using diving have found large blocks of stone, and they're very certain that these were part of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, but that has been destroyed. In the next module, when we look at ancient Greece, we'll look at the statue of Zeus at Olympia, and as you can see from the word Olympia, that's where the Olympic Games originated. And then the 4th one, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, were in ancient Mesopotamia. Now back to our general map of Egypt. Again, you'll see just in this general map, the northern section of Egypt, Giza, that's where the large pyramids are built during the Old Kingdom. We'll talk about more. And as you move towards the south, you'll see Thebes, Karnak, and Luxor, which we'll talk about during the lecture. And these were some of the ancient capitals of the early Egyptians. Now this is obviously a modern aerial photograph of the northern part of Egypt. The first thing you'll notice is it's desert. Lack of vegetation, lack of water, with the notable exception of the Nile River. And you can see the Nile River coming from the south to the north, and it's very green with vegetation along the sides. And then when it gets to the north, it fans out into a delta. And of course, delta is the ancient Greek letter that looks like a pyramid, and that's why this is called a river delta. If you recall from your studies of U.S. geography, the Mississippi River, which starts near Canada, flows south, and as it enters into the Gulf of Mexico near New Orleans, it fans out, and that's called the Mississippi Delta. And as you can see quite readily from this map, it's very, very green because of the fertile, because of the water. Now, Egypt has long been referred to as the gift of the Nile. The Roman historian Herodotus was the one who first said that. And it's because Egyptian civilization was only possible because of the Nile River. We saw in the previous slide that very little of the land in the area is arable, about 5%. But it's important to remember that thin strip along the Nile is extremely fertile. And by a thin strip, we're talking 3, 5, in some areas 10 miles. What? Why? Now we're going back to a time where they didn't have electric pumps, they didn't have artificial fertilizers, because every year to the current date, the Nile River floods in the summer. And when I say it floods, it just doesn't go 1 or 2 inches over the bank. It goes many feet over the bank. It totally covers the area around it for weeks or even months. And this happens like clockwork every year. Well, when the river floods, it leaves, as it withdraws, a lot of mud, referred to as silt, which is a fabulous fertilizer because that silt contains organic material from the African rainforest. And why does the Nile River flood? Well, they don't call a rainforest for nothing. It's because there's a lot of rain. And when it's the rainy season, it doesn't rain all the time in a rainforest. When it's the rainy season, there's so much rain, and from that part of Africa, it is channeled into the Nile River and flows to the Mediterranean. And it's carrying this silt which settles on the land. When the water recedes, the farmers were left with fabulous fertilizer. Obviously, the fields were wet, but what they did also is they built irrigation canals from the Nile to their fields to continue irrigating them. And as we saw in the last unit when we talked about Mesopotamia, to manage the irrigation required a form of social organization, and this obviously led to the political system they had in ancient Egypt, which we'll talk about more. Now, when the Nile floods every year, and it still floods, but in ancient Egypt, the vast majority of the people were peasants, they were farmers, they essentially had nothing to do because they had 4 or 5 feet of water in their fields, and which was nice. The fields were being fertilized, but they clearly couldn't work in the fields. So the pharaohs, particularly during the Old Kingdom, used the peasants to build the pyramids and other monuments. Now the peasants were very devoted to the pharaohs, and again we'll talk about them. They're like the kings as well as a god. The pharaoh is a god, and so they were very devoted to the pharaoh, and so they built the Nile, the pyramids and other structures when the Nile was flooded because the peasants couldn't work in the fields. Now, the textbook and a few people call this slavery. Well, it probably wasn't slavery. Most historians have said it's a form of forced labor because the peasants received food, largely bread, for themselves and their families when they worked in the construction of the pyramid and other construction projects, and they didn't receive it when they didn't work. So it may be a semantic difference between forced labor and slavery. Now, it's crucial to remember that the Nile flows from the south to the north. Those of us who were raised in the United States or have studied American geography know that the Mississippi River, our big river, flows from the north to the south. It starts up near Canada and flows south. And the major rivers that feed into the Mississippi, such as the Ohio River or the Missouri, they all flow sort of in a southerly direction. That's because the land in the northern part of the U.S. is at a higher altitude than in the south. And we all know from kindergarten on that water flows downhill. So we have the water flowing from south to north. And one teacher said, well, as an American, if you want to understand this, just stand on your head and look at Egypt. I didn't quite figure that out. Okay, so when we refer to Upper Egypt, we're referring to the southern section of Egypt, which if you look at a map, you'd call Lower Egypt, but it's Upper Egypt because it's a higher elevation. Likewise, Lower Egypt is the northern section of Egypt with the delta where the water fans out. So it's just the opposite of what you would think. Apart from the current of the Nile, and it's a strong current, there's also a strong wind, a prevailing wind that blows all the time, which flows in the opposite direction from north to south. Now, this is very important for the development of ancient Egypt because all of the transportation was done on the Nile River. They didn't have a road network. We'll see later on the fabulous road network that the ancient Romans constructed. They didn't have roads. They used, well, many roads. They used the river. So what does this mean? Let's look at the next slide. And we can see this in Egyptian hieroglyphics. When a boat wanted to sail up, when a boat wanted to go south, so it starts near the Mediterranean and goes south, it's going against the current. So how would it go against the current? Well, nowadays they use a motor. Obviously didn't have motors then. So they put up a big sail. The wind was coming directly at their backs. You put up a sail and it pushes the boat along the river faster than the current. So this is the hieroglyph we see on the right here with the sails up. And that hieroglyph means to travel south, to go south. So if you read hieroglyphics and you see something and you see that hieroglyph, it means someone is traveling south because the boat has its sails up. Just the opposite. Let's look at the hieroglyph on the left. That is a boat with a sail down. Doesn't quite look like. You can see the rudder sticking out, and that's a hieroglyph for a boat with a sail down. That means the person is going north. Remember, because the current is flowing from the south to the north, so all you do is go with the current. So these are very important in hieroglyphs, and every Egyptian would understand them. So going south or going north. Okay. Now let's just very 10,000 foot view of ancient Egypt history. Roughly 3,000, 3,500 years of what we call ancient Egypt, during which period there were 31 dynasties. And the textbook has a listing of many of those. You don't need to memorize those, but it gives you an idea of the continuity of the culture. And first of all, there was a pre-dynastic period, and then 4 groups of dynasties. We had the Old Kingdom, and we'll see that's when the large pyramids were built. And this is around 2,500 years BCE, or BC. And then about 500 years later, we have the Middle Kingdom. And about 500 years later, what's called the New Kingdom. And roughly 400, 500 years later, we have the late period, which ends in 500 BCE. And then shortly afterwards, a few hundred years later, we have the Roman Empire conquering Egypt. And that's, of course, when we have Cleopatra. Now, looking at the culture of Egypt, during this long period, many thousands of years, it was unified. Unified in the sense that the northern part of Egypt, had essentially the same culture as the southern part. It was a very unified country. It had the same ruler. And why was that? Well, what I talked about a few minutes ago, the Nile connected the country. It was easy to move up and down the Nile with a boat, with the sail up or the sail down. And so you had unified political control and the culture. And obviously, 99.9% of the Egyptians lived right next to the river or close to it. No one lived out in the middle of the desert. And if you want to see the importance of boats in ancient Egypt, I encourage you to go to the wonderful Egyptian gallery here in Houston at the Museum of Natural Science. If you haven't been there, it's up on the top floor, and it's really a wonderful place to go. And part of their permanent collection is a model boat, I guess about 2 feet long. And you can look at it. It's a fairly simple boat with a sail. And this was buried in someone's tomb. And we'll see in a few minutes when people were buried, they were often buried with objects they would use in the next world. Women often took along cosmetics and mirrors. Men took knives. And many people decided to take a boat, thinking, well, they might, it was a small boat, but that was symbolic. They might need it in the afterlife. So the culture was very unified thanks to the Nile. It was consistent over time, largely consistent. If you look at the art, the writing, it's pretty much the same for thousands and thousands of years. For many thousands of years, there's no significant change. The culture, society was very resistant to change. Not many people would go to Egypt. I mean, you remember it's in the middle of the desert. There were time when some Africans, the Nubians, came in from the south and actually controlled much of the country for about 100 years. But in the grand sweep of 3,000 years, that was not much. You also had, coming from northern Egypt, you had influence of the Middle East. You had the Egyptians going out and conquering tribes coming in. But by and large, it was fairly resistant to change. And the worldview was affected by external events. So their view of the world was essentially the same unless there was some major external event. Now, what this led to was, and we'll see the same thing when the Romans, there was a belief things don't change. There's no such thing as progress. What is progress? Our grandchildren will live the same as we do. And a sense that they had the perfect society. And again, we'll see exactly the same thing with the Romans in the Roman Empire. That we've got the perfect society. They really weren't exposed to much else, so why not? Now, this is a very alien concept, particularly to today, particularly to Americans or Europeans, or many cultures. I mean, most of us think of progress. People are often asked in opinion polls, do you think your children will live better than you? And, usually most of them say yes. And if they say no, then politicians worry. So there's a sense, the next iPhone will be better than the last one. Maybe marginally, just a little bit. But, Apple will tell you it's so much better. I mean, think back over the last 10 years. Compare your phone, whether it's Apple or Android or whatever. Compare it to 10 years ago. Compare your laptop. Sources of energy. In 20 years, we'll probably be getting much more energy from solar and other renewable sources. So this was totally alien to the Egyptians. They thought everything was just perfect. It wasn't going to get any better. They didn't have any other views, and they were just going to continue down their merry path. Now, this is reflected, of course, in the political structure, which is an important part of any society and culture. The pharaoh, and the word pharaoh in ancient Egyptian meant the one who lives in the great house. It makes sense. He was the head of the government. He was But he was also viewed as a living god. He was a god. Now, later in Europe, the kings were, they were like the pharaoh, they were the head of the government. But the kings in Europe only said that they were chosen by God to rule. God had asked them to rule or selected them and their family. They never claimed that they were themselves divine, but the pharaohs did. They had absolute power. And I can't emphasize this too much. Absolute power, what today we'd call total dictatorship. The vast majority of the people were illiterate. There wasn't much to read. I mean, they didn't have newspapers or anything. And people thought that their society was perfect, so there was not much rebellion. And the Pharaoh, because of his absolute power and being both a king, the head of the government, and a god, he totally controlled the physical and spiritual world. And that's important to understand, his mummification, his pyramids, etc., etc. Now, the earliest pharaohs were quite smart. They claimed that their main responsibility as the king and god was to ensure that the sun rose every morning and set in the evening. So he told people that, thanks to me, the sun will come up tomorrow. And that's important, obviously, to see. They didn't have electric lights or anything. Agriculture, warmth, whatever. And it's set in the evening. Well, Egypt's pretty hot most of the year, and so the people are very happy when the sun sets in the evening. So he told people that. And the next day the sun came up in the morning and set in the evening, and people thought, this pharaoh is something. He's got a lot of power. And, obviously people didn't understand anything about astronomy then, and so everybody thought that thanks to our pharaoh, we have the sun coming up tomorrow. The sun god Ra, R-A, is by far the most important god in Egypt. The Egyptians had many, many gods. They were pantheistic. And all pharaohs claimed to be directly ascended from the sun god Ra. Okay. Now, the pharaohs set up a system of priests. Well, those were necessary for the people to have religious beliefs. Someone had to go, the pharaoh wasn't going out and talking to the people, so the priests would go out and tell people the importance of the religious system and of the pharaoh. And many, many of the hieroglyphics that people would see would have a sun with rays coming down to the pharaohs. And the priests were sort of semi-divine, and they were relatives of the pharaohs. Now, religion, and we'll see throughout this course, is really an important part of a society or a culture. And for all cultures or societies, no matter what the religion is. And people in ancient Egypt were just really obsessed with immortality and life after death. And I use the word obsessed here because their life revolved around that. The life after death. They believed there was immortality, and life after death. Now, the afterlife would resemble life on earth. That's why people were buried with, mirrors, cosmetics, tools, knives. And so they had everyday objects with them. Now, there was only an afterlife for the Egyptians, the equivalent of a heaven in Judeo-Christianity. There was only an afterlife for good people who had good moral ethics in this world. There's no concept of hell, eternal damnation. So the people who didn't have the good life, well, they just sort of ceased to exist. And the analogy they use is like, what happens to a candle flame when you blow out the candle? Where does it go? It turns into smoke, I guess. Okay. And I already mentioned the sun god Ra was by far the most important. Now, and I put this in red because it's important. This is the first time that religion that we know of becomes ethical. You will only have an afterlife if you have proper ethics on this world. Now, this motivated righteous behavior. It's a very good social tool to keep people in line, if you will. And throughout this course, we'll see religions, most religions that we'll look at are ethical. You must be good to get to the Judeo-Christian heaven, whoops. And if you're not, you may go to hell. And this, raises a question, which often when I'm teaching face-to-face, at this point we stop and discuss, why do so many societies around the world, not just the ones we're studying, around the world, all through recorded history, why did they have religion, some sort of religious belief, a belief in an afterlife? Some didn't have a belief in an afterlife. Was it to instill ethical behavior in people, apart from the religious aspect? And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, afterlife is only for those who lived an ethical life on this world. Now, the soul was called the Ka, K-A, Ka. And the goal was to preserve that soul for the afterlife. You want to make sure that that soul goes to the afterlife. But of course, the body goes with it. So this is why they had so many funeral rituals to prepare the deceased for the day of judgment. And of course, for the king, or the pharaoh rather, and the wealthy, this was elaborate mummification. But there were funeral rituals for everybody, the poorest of the poor. And this is in what's called the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is equivalent to the Bible or the Quran for the ancient Egyptians. It doesn't talk about ethical life here or anything like that. All it is talks about how you prepare a body for judgment. Because there is a judgment where your soul will be looked at to see if you merit an afterlife. And Osiris God is one of those involved in the judgment ceremonies. Now here we have, this is actually, it's from a wall painting. And there's a very good video in this module you should watch that goes through this and a little more. And it's also written on papyrus. So what did they do? In the center, you have a scale. Excuse me, I have terrible allergies today. And they weigh the Ka. So you have a scale there, and you're weighing the Ka, the soul, to see how heavy it is. You can see, if you look carefully, on the right, on our right, there's a feather on one side of the scale. That's a feather. On the left side is the Ka, or the soil. Looks kind of like a piece of red meat or something, but that's the Ka, okay? So that's being weighed, and if the person had a good ethical life, their soul weighs less than the feather. And if that's, so the person would go to what many now call heaven, would have an afterlife. If not, the person would see, the Ka would cease to exist. So you can see, and the people really believe this, and the whole mummification process in Book of the Dead talked about how to prepare for this. Now look at those scales. Those are today, or for many centuries, been called the scale of justice, used in courtrooms around the world. Because what do you do in a courtroom? In the courtroom, the court, which is either the judge by himself or herself, or the jury, literally, quote, weighs the evidence to determine guilt. If you've ever been on a jury, after you hear the evidence, the judge will say, ladies and gentlemen, lay out the law and say, your job now is to weigh the evidence. That means consider the evidence using this scale. This is Lady Justice, and this is outside of a courtroom. And actually, you can see Lady Justice, and in her right hand, what does she have? A scale. And that means that the courtroom will weigh the evidence against the law to determine. You'll notice that Lady Justice always has a blindfold on. It's a little difficult to see in the photo. If you squint, you can see it there, a blindfold. That's because Justice, ideally, is blind. It doesn't matter if it's a rich person, a poor person, their gender, sex, race, blah, blah, blah. It's blindfold. Now, in her left hand, what does she have? A big sword. So that's sort of a warning. Well, if this court finds you guilty, there are ramifications. Now, the Rosetta Stone, I mentioned briefly earlier in the course when we were talking about important cultural artifacts that are outside their country of origin, and you will recall that the Rosetta Stone, the original, is now in the British Museum in London, and the Egyptians very much want it back in Egypt. If you go to the Egyptian Gallery at the Natural Science Museum near downtown, when you walk in, right in front of you is a very good replica of the Rosetta Stone, and with an explanation of it. So, as you see, there are 3 languages. Well, maybe you can't see that, but there are 3 languages there. The top one are Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then you have ancient Greek, and then you have sort of an ancient Egyptian language which was used by the commoners, written language, not as elegant as the hieroglyphs. This stone was so important. Why? Because it allowed people for the first time to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. For many thousands of years, visitors had gone to ancient Egypt and seen the beautiful runes and whatnot, and not been able to read the hieroglyphs, the strange markings. They didn't know what they were, if they were like pictographs or they represented syllables or what. And then, move here. Around the year 1800, the French had already invaded Egypt, and they were building some fortifications in northern Egypt at the town that the French called Rosetta. That was the French name for it. And the French were, and there was a French army officer, a young army officer, about 25 years old, well educated, and the Egyptian workers were tearing down some sort of old wall, and the French army was going to take the stones and build some sort of fort. Well, the French army officer is there, and he notices one of the stones is actually this Rosetta Stone. He said, wow, it has, yes, I can see the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it also has Greek. And that's the same Greek, ancient Greek, that people have read. And the French military officer, having been well educated, had studied several years of Greek in school. In fact, even in the United States at this time, all throughout Europe, anyone like high school would study Greek and Latin and read it. So he immediately called his supervisors, and they brought scientists in. Well, unfortunately for the French, right at this time, the British invaded and took over Egypt. Remember, this was the age of sort of colonialism, imperialism. And the French, surrendered and said, but we're not giving up this rock because we're not quite sure how to read it, but it looks like a key. And the English said, no, we took over. So the English took the stone from the French and shipped it back to the British Museum. They knew it was important, but nobody could really figure out how to use it. So what did they do? Well, they didn't have photographs or anything then, so they made wax impressions of the stone. What they did is they put wax, and it was an early method to copy things, and they rubbed charcoal paper on it. And they sent that to all the leading scientists and mathematicians in Europe, and then they sent it to some in the United States, which of course was a brand new country then. And finally, a French scientist, this several years, people were trying to figure out if they could read. The goal was to decipher those hieroglyphics using Greek as the key. And a couple of years later, a French scientist was sitting there at home, pulling his hair out, trying to figure it out. And his 12-year-old kid said, "Oh, Dad, look, there's an oblong shape around these characters in the hieroglyphics and the same Greek characters." Now that's called a cartouche, Cartuch. And that's in the hieroglyphics, they put that around the name of all the pharaohs because it's like an honorific. And the French scientist said, "You're right, son, you're right, son." And then figured out that name, because they could read the Greek, and started to decipher it. Well, it took several years to figure this all out. And so, thanks to the 12-year-old kid, came up with a key, they were able to finally read hieroglyphics. This really increased interest in the US and Europe and Egypt, and it started what was called Egyptomania. People just wanted to go to Egypt to see this now that they the scientists could read it. It's still very difficult, obviously, to read the hieroglyphs, but people started learning a lot more. Otherwise, it was like this unknown civilization there. So the Rosetta Stone is of supreme importance. That's why when you walk into the Egyptian Gallery here in Houston, you'll see it right at the entrance. There's a 4 or 5 minute video in the module, which I strongly encourage you to read. It starts off showing the Rosetta Stone in London at the British Museum, and you can see just hundreds of tourists around it. People just get around it and they take photos, they take selfies. And then if you go to the gift shop, they sell probably hundreds of things related to the Rosetta Stone. You can get a keychain with a Rosetta Stone, you name it. There's also a company now that teaches foreign languages called Rosetta Stone. You may have seen. And they claim that their courses are like the Rosetta Stone. They're the key to learning other languages. And so it's really, and you'll also hear, or you read sometimes here in the TV news, a major discovery, scientific discovery in medicine or something. And people will say, "Oh, will this be the Rosetta Stone to curing cancer," or something like that. So, excuse me, terrible allergies still. So just looking briefly at Egyptian art, the principal function of Egyptian artists was to produce images of the gods, the deities. And then, of course, the pharaoh was the main one. The pharaoh himself, he dominated everything. He dominated art. He said these are the standards. And then artists also started producing temples and shrines for honoring the deities. Excuse me, the pyramids. Most people, when they think of Egypt, think of the pyramids. The pyramids started off as funerary monuments to pharaohs. Pharaohs were buried underneath, and instead of a little tombstone, they built a monument for the pharaohs. It wasn't to worship the pharaoh there, but it was to help the pharaoh in the route to the afterlife. The pharaoh's tomb was located in the center, and always the pharaohs were buried with many precious jewels, with many objects to use in the afterlife. And early on, they used to take in some of the pharaoh's slaves and kill them right there. The thought being, well, they'll go to the afterlife with the pharaoh. After a few hundred years of doing that, they decided it would be better to make little statues of the key slaves. And so they buried these little statues with the pharaohs, and those would supposedly come to life in the afterlife and serve the pharaoh. Upper class people, the nobles, were buried near the pharaohs. Now, because of the belief that the body was absolutely necessary to accompany the soul, they started the mummification process. Some people think mummification, something to do with mommy. Well, it's one of the Turkish ointments used in the mummification process. They put the bandages around, they put a special ointment, which was kind of a glue to hold the bandages together. That came from Turkey, and the Turkish word sounds like mummy. And so that's why they started calling it mummification. Now, there's a very elaborate mummification process. This is all spelled out in the Book of the Dead we talked about a few minutes ago. And they're very, very elaborate for the pharaohs and other members of the royal family. And in fact, the wall paintings in the caves are often from the Book of the Dead, telling people how to get to the afterlife. But everyone had access to some form of mummification and the afterlife. And the module has a very short 3 or 4 page article from the National Geographic online that talks about these early kind of funeral homes that catered to everyone. So someone came in really poor, their mummification would be maybe put some kind of cloth around them, and they were just buried down below in the deeps and the hot sand. And those bodies, even if they don't have anything wrapped around them, the bodies will last many thousands of years because the sand is so dry and it sucks the moisture out of the body, so you don't get the rotting. And you can see the same thing, for instance, in northern Peru, where it hasn't rained I don't know how many hundreds of years, and the ancient people in fact, until fairly recently, the people in that area would put their deceased loved ones in a fetal position in a grave, nude, and archaeologists could now go in and dig them up and dig up a body from several thousand years old, and you can still see the hair on it. Well, actually, there is a mummy, an actual mummy, in the Museum of Natural Science here in Houston. And last time I was there, you could see the hair. I think it was like reddish hair, reddish brown hair. It's actual hair. It's not like fake hair. And the skin is preserved also. It's because it's so dry. Now, the mummification process was designed to dry out the body even more. And so one of the videos in this module talks about the process. There were special people for the wealthy, the pharaohs and all, who would go through the process. They took out the internal organs, which are wet, and they put those into jars. They call them canopic jars, and put a lid on, and those are buried. It's gross to think of, but to get the brain out, they put some kind of wire hook up the nose and pulled the brain out. And then in those body cavities, they would put in special salts and fragrances which would absorb the moisture. And they'd leave those in so the body, for the wealthy people, doesn't have any sort of moisture in it. And then, of course, they wrap lots of bandages around and put oils. And one of those oils, which was rather sticky, sounds like mummy in Turkish. And that's why they were called mummies. Now, when they buried people, they wanted, to put the people in the earlier pyramids as deep as possible. So they dig underground. And the thought was the afterlife is like in the middle of the earth or something. So the deeper you were buried, the higher the social class. So these are the earliest pyramids. This is in sort of northern Egypt, in Saqqara. This is called the Mastaba. It's an early form of a pyramid. They call it a wedding cake design. You know how when you go to a wedding, the cake, well, the cake is usually circular. It could be square, and as you go up each layer. So it started off with 2 layers, and then they added 3, and it started going up. And then it evolved into the pyramid when they started to smooth out the sides. And so you have a nice slanting side. So these are called mastabas. And this particular one here, Saqqara, has underneath, well, the earliest pharaohs for 1,000 years roughly were buried there. But what's amazing are the many millions of mummified animals they've found. And they've only found these in recent years in deep shafts. People, archaeologists like to dig. They were digging, and they went down, and believe it or not, they found 8 million dogs. 8 million dogs. They'd gone through a formal mummification process. They take out the internal organs, put salt in, wrap them up. 3 million birds, 2 million cats. Isn't that incredible? And those were from people who brought them as offerings to the gods. Even the poorest people would buy, someone would say, here's a mummified dog or bird or cat, and they'd take it and they'd throw it in this big hole. I mean, the hole went down like 100 feet, and that was an offering to the god. Now, people believe that animals, like people, had souls. So the animals also had souls, so they needed to be mummified. And these animal mummies are considered, quote, votive mummies, and they're used to carry messages to the gods. So the idea was you take a cat, or particularly cats, they mummified lots of cats. You take a cat or a dog, and you mummify it, and you throw it in the hole, and with a message to the gods, like, help my family, cousin Joe is sick, whatever. And the idea was that the gods would answer those prayers. Now, it's interesting, the very same word votive is used today to describe the candles in a Christian church, which people light to seek divine intervention. And there, the candlelight signifies the prayer, which is offered, and the light, is entering the light of God. I mean, this is a photo I pulled up on the internet, and I'm not sure it's true, but a lot of archaeologists compare this to the mummification of cats and dogs. You might have your own thoughts on that, in that people are using something symbolic to get their message to God. And often, people are lighting the candle, asking God's intercession to help someone who's sick or ill, or someone who's just died. I'm not sure it's a very good analogy, but quite a few archaeologists use that analogy. Okay, this is the end of the first part of our discussion of ancient Egypt, and I look forward to seeing you in part number 2.